Have you ever felt a strange heaviness in your legs, almost like your blood isn't flowing the way it used to, and no matter how much you rest, something just feels off? Because here's what most people over 60 don't realize. That feeling isn't always just aging. In many cases, it's an early warning that your circulation is slowly changing, and your blood may not be moving as smoothly as it should. And what makes this even more uncomfortable is, it's not always caused by something obvious. Sometimes it's coming from something you eat every single day, something you've trusted for years, something you would never expect to turn against you. In fact, there are certain vegetables that seem completely healthy on the surface, but after 60, they can start interacting with your body differently, quietly affecting how your blood behaves. That's exactly why the idea of stop eating these 3 vegetables after 60, they're destroying your health, feels so shocking at first, because it goes against everything you've been told. But here's the real question. What if one of those vegetables is already a regular part of your daily meals, and it's been slowly working against your body, without giving you any clear warning signs at all? Now here's where things start to get a little uncomfortable. Because for years, you've been told something very simple. Vegetables are always safe, always healthy. And most people never question that. But after 60, something quietly changes. And it's not the food. It's how your body starts reacting to it. Because as circulation slows down, and your system becomes more sensitive, certain compounds that once felt completely harmless can begin to affect your blood in ways you don't immediately notice. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly over time. And that's exactly why some people begin to feel those small signs. That heaviness in the legs, that unusual sluggishness, those random drops in energy that don't make sense. But here's the part most people miss. They never connect it back to what they're eating every single day. And the more regularly it's consumed, the more quietly it builds up. Now this doesn't mean all vegetables are bad, but there are a few, very specific ones, that under the wrong conditions can start interfering with how your blood flows. And one of them is something many people over 60 eat almost every day, without ever thinking twice about it. So the question becomes, what if the thing you trust the most is the one quietly working against you? And this is where things start to get more serious than most people realize. Because blood flow isn't just about your heart pumping. It's about how smoothly everything moves through your body every second of the day. And after 60, that smooth flow doesn't always stay the same. It can become less efficient, less predictable, and more sensitive to what you do every day. Which means even small changes can start to matter more than they used to. Not in a sudden way, but in a gradual shift that most people never notice at first. And over time, this can show up as those small signs people often ignore. That slight heaviness in the legs, that unexplained discomfort, or moments where your energy just doesn't feel stable anymore. And the frustrating part is, most people never connect these changes to their daily food choices, because certain compounds in everyday foods can quietly influence how your circulation behaves, sometimes in a supportive way, and sometimes under the wrong conditions, not so supportive anymore. And this is where it gets interesting, because one of the vegetables we're about to talk about is something many people over 60 actually try to eat more of, thinking it's helping them. But what if, in this stage of life, it's doing something completely different inside your body? And this is where things start to get a little uncomfortable. Because the first vegetable on this list is not something unusual. In fact, it's something most people over 60 are actively encouraged to eat more of, especially when trying to stay healthy, manage blood pressure, or improve overall nutrition, which is exactly why almost no one questions it. But here's where things get interesting. Because after 60, your body doesn't always respond to foods the same way it used to. And in certain cases, something that is generally considered healthy can start interacting differently inside your system. Not in a dramatic way, and not in a way you would immediately notice, but in a way that slowly influences how smoothly your circulation works, especially if your body is already dealing with age-related changes or medications that affect blood flow balance. And the real problem is, you don't feel it happening directly. There are no obvious alarms, no sudden warning signs, just small things, like slightly more fatigue than usual, a mild heaviness that comes and goes, or moments where your energy doesn't feel as stable as before. And because these changes are so gradual, most people never connect them back to what they eat every day. Especially because this particular vegetable is actually recommended in most general health advice, which is exactly why it stays in people's diet without any second thought. But when you understand how it behaves in the body after 60, especially in terms of circulation sensitivity, it starts to raise a very different question. Backhand index pointing right, what if something widely considered healthy is not equally neutral for everyone? And that's where the first vegetable comes in. And now here's what you really need to understand. Not emotionally, but practically. Because this is not about creating fear around food. It's about noticing patterns most people completely miss until their body starts reacting differently over time. After 60, your body doesn't respond with the same flexibility it once had. Circulation becomes more sensitive, recovery slows down, and small daily habits can start to add up in ways that weren't noticeable before. And this is why some people begin to notice small changes. Not sudden ones, but gradual shifts, like slightly reduced stamina, occasional dizziness, or that feeling that the body just isn't as smooth and responsive as it used to be. And what makes this even more important is that these changes are rarely linked back to one single cause. Because it's usually not just one thing. It's a combination: lifestyle, activity level, hydration, and sometimes even medications that already influence how blood flows in the body. And when all of these factors overlap, that's when certain foods start to behave differently inside the system. Not because they are bad, but because the body is no longer responding the same way it used to. And this brings us to something important. Because the first vegetable we talked about is just one part of the picture. The second one is even more common. So common that most people over 60 eat it almost every day without hesitation, believing it is purely beneficial for heart health and circulation. But under certain conditions, it can quietly contribute to the same concerns in a way that is even harder to notice early on. And once you understand how it behaves after 60, you start to realize why it deserves closer attention, especially if you're already noticing small circulation-related changes that are easy to ignore. And that brings us directly to the next one. And this is where things start to get much more interesting. Now let's talk about the second vegetable. And this is where things become even more important to understand. Because unlike the first one, this is something people don't just eat occasionally. They often include it in their daily meals, believing it is actively protecting their heart and improving circulation. It has a very strong health food reputation, especially among seniors trying to manage cholesterol, blood pressure, or overall heart health. Which is exactly why almost nobody questions it. But here's where things quietly shift. After 60, your body doesn't respond to foods the same way it used to. Internal balance becomes more sensitive, and how natural compounds interact with circulation and blood flow can start to change. Not because the food becomes harmful on its own, but because the system receiving it is no longer the same. And under certain conditions, especially when combined with low activity, dehydration, or medications that already affect blood flow balance, its impact can become more noticeable than people expect. Not suddenly, but gradually over time. And that's why most people never connect it back to diet. Because there are no clear warning signs. Just small changes, like feeling heavier during simple movement, slower recovery after walking, or that subtle sense that circulation isn't as smooth as before. And the frustrating part is, these changes feel exactly like normal aging, which is why they are almost always ignored. And what makes this even more concerning is, many people actually increase their intake of this vegetable after hearing general health advice online, thinking more is better, when in reality, after 60, balance becomes far more important than excess. And this is where misunderstanding health advice can quietly work against you instead of helping you. But even then, this is still not the most important part, because there is one more vegetable left. And this one is even more overlooked, even though it may have the strongest hidden influence on circulation stability. And that's where everything is about to become much more surprising. Now, before we move to the last vegetable, there's something important you need to understand clearly. Because if you're thinking right now, I eat these foods every day, should I be worried? That's not the point here. This is not about panic, and it's not about removing everything from your diet overnight. It's about understanding that after 60, your body no longer responds in a simple, fixed way. What used to feel completely neutral before can now depend on your internal condition. Things like hydration, activity level, circulation health, and certain medications all start to matter more than they used to. And this is where general advice often misses the reality, because it treats food as either good or bad. But in reality, your body is now operating on a much more sensitive system than before. And when circulation becomes even slightly less efficient, it's rarely one single food that causes a change. It's the combination, repetition, and timing that slowly adds up over time. Which is why many people don't notice anything at first, until small things begin to appear, like more frequent fatigue, heaviness in the legs, or that unexplained feeling that your body is not as responsive as it used to be. But by then, the pattern has already been building quietly in the background. And this is exactly why the third vegetable is so surprising. Because unlike the others, this one is actually considered one of the safest options for seniors, recommended in almost every basic heart-healthy diet plan, which is why almost nobody questions it. But under certain conditions after 60, it can behave in a way most people would never expect. And once you understand what it does inside the body, the final piece of this puzzle finally starts to make sense. And now we come to the third and final vegetable. And this is the one most people trust the most, which is exactly why it gets overlooked completely in conversations like this. Because unlike foods that already feel controversial, this one is usually seen as completely safe, recommended in diet plans, hard health guides, and almost every general nutrition advice for seniors. It's considered gentle, supportive, and beneficial. The kind of food you would never think twice about. But here's where things become more important after 60. Because even foods that are generally healthy can behave differently when your internal balance changes. And this vegetable is no exception. Under normal conditions, it supports digestion, provides nutrients, and is often linked with better cardiovascular health. But when your body is already dealing with slower circulation, increased sensitivity, or medications that affect blood flow regulation, its effect can become more noticeable depending on how often and how much it's consumed. Not in a dangerous or immediate way, but in a gradual shift that builds quietly over time. And the real issue is not the vegetable itself. It's the assumption that safe automatically means unlimited. Because that assumption is what leads many people to overconsume it without variation. And over time, that repetition, combined with other lifestyle factors, can influence how the body responds in subtle ways. Now, when you look at all three vegetables together, a clearer picture starts to form. It was never about one food being bad. It was about how everyday choices interact with a body that changes with age. And once that understanding clicks, the focus shifts away from fear and towards something much more useful: learning how to adjust your habits for the body you have today, not the body you had years ago. And when you step back from all of this, the most important realization is actually very simple. It was never about labeling foods as good or bad. And it was never about creating fear around things you've eaten your whole life. The real point is awareness. Because after 60, your body doesn't respond exactly the same way it used to. It becomes more sensitive, more responsive, and sometimes less predictable in how it handles familiar things over time. And that means even the same daily diet can feel slightly different inside your system than it did years ago. Not suddenly, but gradually over time. Which is why most people never connect small signals like fatigue, a slower recovery, or occasional heaviness to long-term habits. Because it rarely feels like one clear cause. It feels like normal aging. But once you understand that your body has changed, you stop relying only on general advice and start paying attention to your own signals instead. And that shift is what really matters, because it allows you to make adjustments based on your current body, not the version of your body from years ago. So instead of restriction, it becomes about awareness. Instead of fear, it becomes about understanding. And in the end, the goal is not to avoid food, but to understand what your body is quietly telling you, and respond to it with awareness, not assumption.